For today's episode, I have a very interesting guest here on the Pathmark Presents podcast, where we love to talk about the different paths to generate clients and the digital world. And essentially, we're going to speak with Jake Jorgovan today. He is actually heading up two very interesting companies. One of them is the Content Allies, which supports B2B companies to build up their revenue-focused podcasts. We, being a podcast here, very curious to learn more about what Jake and his team is doing over there. And then there is Lead Cookie. I'm pretty sure some of you guys have actually heard about Lead Cookie already, who've been, some waves in the outbound sales world, especially, I've been hearing early interviews where Jake was talking a lot about LinkedIn and channels like that. So I'm very curious. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on here.
Very good. So yeah, maybe give us a bit of an insight. I mentioned the two companies that you're running. So how do they work together? What do they focus on? Maybe give us a bit of an insight what they're all about.
Yeah, so the first company that I really had success with was Lead Cookie, which began really as primarily a LinkedIn lead generation agency, and we've evolved to really doing full-fledged outbound across LinkedIn, email, and cold calling at this point. But that is really kind of where it began. We've got a lot of initial traction there and what we've become really known for in a lot of ways. But at this point, we really do focus a lot on kind of full service B2B lead generation is the focus there. And I've been building that up for several years. And it's a good company. I've got two guys who are partners there who are phenomenal, who run the day-to-day. And over the years, one of the things that I've found is that lead generation as a business model, it's great and you can provide a good service to people, but it's not a phenomenal business model in general. Just because it's hard to retain customers for a long time, just because honestly, like you will saturate someone's market. So we might run a campaign for someone for 6 months and it's like, okay, we've hit the great leads that are in there. We have reached out to them across the various channels that we can. And at this point, you kind of get diminishing returns, and maybe you return to that campaign later and you try a different approach with them. But it's something where just kind of baked into the inherent lead generation model, there's just a decent level of churn, which makes it kind of hard to really scale or grow a business. And so that is, it's been a great company and it is very stable. We do really great work. I'm very proud of the work we do for our customers, and we've really grown as like a very quality provider in that space. In a space where there's a lot of outbound companies that are, I would say, just spammers. So there's, I very much am happy with the quality that we are doing and the work we're doing. But at some point I wanted to build a company that I did believe could grow, have better retention, had more room for scale and everything there. And that's where I started really getting interested into content marketing and launched Content Allies, which went through a variety of pivots, but ended up landing on basically our focus is helping B2B companies launch revenue generating podcasts, where we basically help a company launch a podcast, and then we do outreach to schedule guests between interviews with their ideal customers, strategic partners, people that they would want to do business with or build revenue relationships with. And that has been, as you can tell, there's a little bit of an outbound component to that as well. But that has really become my focus for a lot of my time and energy over the past few months and everything. And so those are the two companies, Lead Cookie on the B2B lead generation and Content Allies on the podcast production for B2B.
Very cool. So let's say if a B2B listener, a marketer would be interested, and listens up to what you guys are doing with Content Allies, like maybe could you walk us through the process? Like what does it take to get started with you guys?
Yeah, so our whole goal for a B2B company is to make it very, very much like very little work on their side. With podcasting, there is a ton of tools where you can do this yourself. You can do it very inexpensively if you're a small business. But the problem with podcasting is that it's actually a lot to manage. I'm sure you guys know this as running your own podcast is, you've got the audio editor, then if you want to turn that into video clips, and then you need a writer to create show notes and social posts, and then a designer to create thumbnails. And so literally within any single episode we create, there's 7 people who touch the podcast. And so for our side, our whole entire goal with it is like, how do, if our clients are B2B tech companies, They're hungry for growth. They want to build relationships. They want to just be speaking and creating great content. Our goal is to, like, you show up for one onboarding call, maybe two, if you need a little bit more time to kind of decide on some stuff. And then after that, basically, like, our clients just show up for interviews and we do everything else. And so that's our entire kind of model around it. Is it's not for the people who, that you could produce this yourself much more inexpensively, but it's the people who don't have the time or energy to kind of manage that entire process. We're just a kind of a plug and play solution where you sign up and we start scheduling you calls between people that you want to talk to, and you get to do interviews with them, build relationships, and we pretty much handle everything.
But like, if somebody's listening, what would be the typical amount of episodes that you would be running? So if somebody's starting to envision now, like, okay, I'm going to start with my podcast, like what should they expect their podcast to kind of, look like?
Yeah, I'd say for most customers, they're starting with weekly, and that tends to be a good cadence. And then typically if, someone wants to ramp up, we've got some customers that are going twice weekly. And that is a pretty still intense kind of cadence to go with for a lot of people to kind of have that many interviews. We actually do 3 times weekly internally, but that's, because we love this and we do it all the time. But it's, I'd say most people start weekly. Once you've got, you're like, hey, I've got a backlog recorded of 2 months out, then you can start looking at, ramping up the speed. But that's what I always recommend. People start weekly, ramp up the speed once you get a backlog and you've got enough people going and everything.
Makes sense. I would be curious. Let's switch gears a little bit, right? With Lead Cookie and Content LAC, obviously have some outbound focused companies. I would be curious though, what would you consider is the main journey that somebody's going through in order to get started with those companies? Are you, leveraging outbound yourself? Is this, did inbound take over because of Lead Cookie's name? I'm curious, how did that work?
Yeah, it's something where I think when it comes down to outbound, there's all this noise out there and these people that like preach tactics or specific like scripts that are going to convert, and like they'll gladly sell you a course on some high converting script or something like that. But really what it comes down to, it's like outbound is really simple. It comes down to, first of all, like making sure that you're targeting the right people. And that sounds obvious, but with most people, like, we'll just load up a Sales Navigator search queue, and then they load in one of these bots into the search queue, and then they just start blasting people with really irrelevant messaging. And then they're wondering why they're not getting results, or they hire a really cheap agency where that's all that the agency does. And so making sure that like you are hitting the exact right people that you want to hit, that is like step one, because nothing else matters if you reach out to the wrong person. And once you've got the right person, then it comes down to the messaging, and it comes down to saying like, okay, where's that prospect at? Where do they want to go? And then showing that you are the best person to take them there. And so demonstrating that through social proof, demonstrating that through that you understand their value point or their pain points and their like value of what they want. And you're able to communicate that in a clear and concise way. And so the messaging is really kind of that next part, which hooks someone, gets them interested. And then the final piece after that is like, once you get someone interested, you get them to a call. Like, this is where a lot of people don't talk about it. There's like all about just getting the response rates. But what you'll find is a lot of people with outbound is they'll get responses, they'll get engagements, but then they get like no closes. They won't close anything. And that's because inbound and outbound leads are drastically different. And basically that outbound leads don't trust you. Like, there's zero trust. And a lot of people, if they're new to outbound, they may have only had business that's come through referrals, relationship. Maybe they've got their inbound marketing working. And in all those cases, like a referral is a super high trust deal. Like, someone trusts you when they're coming in the door. If someone's coming through inbound, through content you've put out, they've consumed your content, they are, showing intent to buy, they're interested. But with outbound, you're showing up on someone's door. You have no idea if they're actually ready to buy right now. And they have every reason to be skeptical that you're like a scammer. And like, you got to realize that that's not anything bad. Like, that's just the reality of outbound. And so it takes a lot of touch points. It often takes more calls. It takes being intentional about sending referrals, sharing case studies. It takes a lot more work on the back end to close an outbound deal But, on content marketing, it's like you do all the work on the front end to get that warm inbound. With outbound, it's like you do very little work on the front end. You just send the messaging, you get it out there, you get a response, but then you got to do more work on the back end of the sale. So that's one of the ways we like to think about outbound and everything and how we look at it.
Gotcha. Okay. Very interesting. Super, super good. And that means like at the moment that would be split between inbound and outbound for the two companies that you're running, or is that, have a heavy weight on one or the other?
I guess for our own marketing or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say we have a pretty good split there. We do a lot of our own podcasting to build that up as a channel, to build relationships there. We also still run our own outbound as well. But again, it's the other great thing is I think when you do good quality work, we've learned that we analyzed this just recently, and it's like over half of our business right now, it's just coming through referrals. And it's not referral partners or anything. It's just customers that have worked with us. Or honestly, like my sales guy he's really great at not selling to people that we can't actually help. And so we turn a lot of people away, and we've found that the people we turn away and we're genuinely like, hey, you shouldn't use this channel, or we don't think that this is a good idea for you. They are like one of our best referral sources, because the fact that we genuinely turn customers away that want to pay us, it's a really big trust builder, and then people end up referring more customers our way. So yeah, doing good work, having a good reputation goes a long way.
Very good. Obviously, in the Pathmark Presents podcast, we cannot go around also asking a question about the website. Like, what role, for example, the lead cookie website, what role do you attribute to the website in terms of, Growth?
Yeah, it's we actually just relaunched our website literally like a couple of weeks ago, and it's hard to say. I will say that I am just now this year really diving in and learning SEO and like traffic building strategies. Most of the growth that I have had through my companies has been a result of, like I said, outbound, through inbound, through some level, through podcasting, through relationships, referral partners. So my website properties have not been super highly optimized or traffic generating in the past, but that is something that this year I've been investing a lot more time into learning SEO, building out SEO processes, and that is something that we are diving into. But to be honest, it has not been a major growth channel for us.
Okay, cool, super interesting. I would love to learn a little bit about your perspective on outbound, because you've been in the arena for quite a while. I would be curious to ask you, what would you say is the biggest challenge when it comes to outbound marketing? When I say the word innovation,
I think one of the biggest things is honestly the rapidly changing landscape. At the time we're recording this in late March 2021, the past couple of weeks, LinkedIn has been rolling out connection request limits down to 100 per week. And we saw this coming. I wrote an article about this years ago. I was like, LinkedIn's going to throttle back organic outreach, and they're going to charge you to send in mails. Like that's where the platform's going. And that is something that I've expected for a while, and we're now seeing it. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is, first it comes down to the message, like the getting the right targeting and then the messaging. But I think the other thing is that these platforms are constantly changing, and you kind of have to learn and navigate this. And, we've got a white label. We are a white label provider for a very large outbound agency, and they've talked many times about bringing their LinkedIn in-house. And then every time that LinkedIn just goes through another one of these changes, they're just like, God, we don't even want to think about that, because it's what we have to learn and deal with. Like, we know the nuances, the ins and outs of the platform. We see these things, we see how to kind of get around stuff, or like what to do. And so I think that those are some of the biggest changing. You saw this happen with cold email over the past few years. Email deliverability rates tanked super heavily, and it took a lot of time. You used to, like 3-4 years ago, you could just register a new G Suite account and just start sending emails to people. And now it takes an entire thing of setting up all of your records on the back end properly. And then basically, doing a long period of warming up that email address. And so it's an entire process and operation that we have to do for every account that we run now. So I think that those logistical challenges, I think, are making it hard for a lot of companies to actually do this in-house, because there's like the learning curve on those things is hard, and it's constantly changing. And like we're in like a mastermind with a few of the other companies like this, where we're just trying to stay on top of all the chaotic changing that's happening in the world, which almost distracts you then from the targeting and the messaging, which is actually the core most important part. But it's like also none of that matters if your message doesn't get delivered. So
very good. What would you say is the biggest challenge in outbound when it comes to return on investment?
I would say the biggest thing is probably just, I think a lot of companies go into it when, if the deal value isn't high enough, it's just honestly not worthwhile. Like I would say 15 to 20 grand, like minimum deal value, is what you want to be looking at to consider really outbound. But really where I think it works well is the people where it's like you're doing a 100K deal, you're getting a 250K deal. And like you're doing very large deals. And I think a lot of people turn toward outbound and they're looking at, okay, we've got some software product that's, $3 grand a year or $5 grand a year. And it's like it is harder to get it an ROI there at those levels versus having like the handful of big wins throughout a year that kind of justifies and makes it all worth it. That being one of them. And then I think the other one, just the time to ROI, in that we often have customers where we'll run a campaign for 6 months and then they'll pause and then they'll come back to us 8-9 months later and be like, oh God, we just closed some huge customers out of that. But like, it takes a long time because like I said, with outbound, you're reaching out to someone, they might not be ready to buy. When you get an inbound or a referral or something that comes to you, that person's like in buying mode. That's why they're reaching out to you. But when you're going to outbound, it's like for you guys, if you're going and you've got, a site conversion tool, it's like, well, you don't know if a person's in a buying cycle like that. If you're doing outbound, someone comes to you inbound, they're actively searching and looking. And so, you might just be getting on someone's radar. And then a year and a half later, they're like, oh, we need to look into these kind of conversion tools. Oh yeah, there's that one that I talked about. Let me reach back out to them. And so that's like a common thing we see, where we actually just had one of our best customers took a break for a year, came back and was just like, wow, I just closed a ton of stuff over the past year. But it takes a while. And so I think that timeline to ROI is another big part of it.
Super interesting. I want to switch gears a little bit and learn about you personally, right? You've been, building up the company. So I'm very curious to learn a little bit about your habits of educating yourself, and where do you turn in order to consume content. Maybe you could tell us, like, where do you educate yourself and how do you filter content in order to read stuff that you actually brings you forward?
Yeah, I actually don't consume a very heavy amount of business content these days. I did a ton for years, and then I think at some level it becomes noise, like especially all of the business books. And so some of my rules of thumb are like, I only read a book if it's recommended to me from multiple sources. So I need, like, if someone's like, oh, this is a great book, you got to read this. It's like, I need like 3 people to tell me that before I actually like consider reading it. Other things I look at is, just trying to find like very specific information these days. So these days I'm looking less for the big picture kind of fluffy storytelling kind of stuff out there. And I look very much at specific information. So right now I'm starting to learn Webflow because I want to up our web skills and stuff like that with our websites. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to put my education time into like taking some programs on Webflow, and I've got my designer working on them. And I was like, but I want to have at least enough of a education of this platform so I can adequately use it, because I'm very active in managing all of our sites, which have been on Squarespace up until this point. So I put a lot of time into very specifics, which I love LinkedIn Learning. As well, LinkedIn Learning, which they bought lynda.com, who I think that lynda.com was more valuable than my entire college education in terms of my career advancement. So that's where I go in a lot of that. But then, those are the main places that I go to look. I don't consume a crazy amount of other content on business stuff these days.
I see. Since we're slowly coming to the end of the interview, I would love to jump into our rapid fire questions. Are you ready for those?
Yeah, I'm ready.
I mean, you just kind of gave this one already away. I was about to ask you, what's the last book you read? Maybe I should ask you, what's the last course you took?
Last course I took was actually, well, it's not at all related to business, but I took a course on building modular synthesizers. So that's where I'm actually spending a lot more of my time reading or learning, is completely non-business related stuff these days. So
very good. What's the one single thing that you focused on the most for your company?
I would say I think the biggest thing is just personal development, and to an extent, and just focusing on getting yourself clear. There's a mantra that my advisor once shared with me, is your business is a reflection of yourself. And so if you're not in a good mental headspace, or you're not in a good spot, then like your business is going to reflect that. So I think I spend a lot of time just focusing on myself and my own personal development. And I think that's a really key part of it.
Very cool. If there would be no boundaries in technology, what's the one thing that you would wanted to have fixed for the company today?
I wanted to have fixed. If it can just do all of my work for me, if it can, I definitely do. I'm intrigued at all these solutions. I haven't tried them all, but all these ones that are coming out about like kind of reinventing the inbox, because that is something that is a daily pain point and frustration. So I've looked at these things like, hey, I've never actually tried one yet, but that is something that is on my radar. Is there a better way to actually know what's important in my email versus opening up and having, 70 unread emails in a day and really only 10 that are important. That is, I feel, something I would love to see properly fixed.
Gotcha. And the very last question would be, if today would be your very first day, you starting to work on Lead Cookie, right? Going a little bit back, what's the one advice that you would give yourself?
I think if I started it today, actually, I have a lot of people that come to me trying to start lead generation agencies today. And I tell them it's not a great business model. You should probably consider something else. And I just let them know where that is. But I think for that particular model. But I think the biggest thing I would say is like, if someone's just starting on their entrepreneurial journey, is like, you're going to screw up a lot of stuff. And it's just part of it. Like, you're going to fail. It's going to be miserable. Like, you're not going to know what you're doing, but surround yourself by some people that are further ahead of you in the game. At that stage you're at, read a lot of business books and like study a lot of things, but don't assume that they are the answers, just that they educate you. And I think probably just like learn the fundamentals, learn finance, learn legal contracts, learn sales, learn marketing. Like, you've got to, as an entrepreneur, you've got to learn each of those skills. And for a long time, I would neglect any number of those. And at some point in the journey, each one of those will come back to bite you. And I had a painful experience with legal contracts. I had a painful experience with finance, and all these things that then forced me to be like, okay, I'm going to learn how to do business finances better now. And so I think the biggest thing I would say is to like, the excuse, or you hear this when people are like, oh, I'm not good at sales. It's like, that's too bad. Like, you got to get good at sales if you're going to run a business. So I think that would be my advice there, is just to learn all the individual skills, and just take time, and don't have the story that you're not good at something.
Very cool. Jake, I really appreciate that you took the time for the Pathmark Presents podcast today. I want to give you, maybe the last word. If somebody would be forgetting everything that we discussed, maybe about content alleys, maybe if you let them, what's the one thing that they should remember about content alleys?
Yeah, so for content allies, I think the biggest thing to realize is that podcasting is not just about the audience. It's about the relationships you build. And you will actually get a much faster ROI from the relationships that you build through podcasting than what you're going to get through the actual content itself. The content's almost like a bonus on top of the relationships and the networking you get to do. So I always like to share that. That's one of the big things I'm really trying to preach about podcasting, and one of the things I love about the platform.
Thanks a lot for being part of Pathmark Presents.
Thank you.